In the first half of the 19th century, Americans began to leave the East and head for the Promised Land, the Wild West. The Oregon Trail, a 2.000-mile trail, was no ordinary road, but a brutal test of faith, survival, and human character. Not everyone left home for gold. Some left because they were hungry. Others left because they had nothing to lose. Laws like the Oregon Donation Land Act promised 320 to 640 acres of free land, fueling the dream of a new life, where the poor could become landowners, where families could start over. But that dream came with a price, leaving everything familiar, crossing raging rivers, towering mountains, and thirsty deserts, with the faint hope that something better would come at the end of the journey. Imagine you had a few cubic feet to hold your entire life. What would you take with you? Flour, bacon, coffee, a shotgun, a Bible, a few pots, a dairy cow, and often, not the dog, the piano, or the wedding dress. Many set out optimistically, thinking they would get there in a few weeks. But in reality, it would take 4 to 6 months, and no one could have prepared for what lay ahead. As the wheels began to roll, the atmosphere in the convoys was still festive. Children laughed, women baked bread over fires, and men talked about building new homes. It felt like an entire community was leaving together to create a future. But then, a wheel broke. The first cow collapsed from exhaustion. A child had a fever that wouldn't go away. The truth began to set in. This was no picnic. This was a one-way trip. Thousands of personal stories, scattered like stones along the roadside. Harriet Palmer, 11, remembers the day her parents were forced to abandon her dog because it couldn't keep up with the convoy. J. Henry Brown tells of burying his father by the roadside, then setting off the next morning, because stopping too long meant death. There is no time to heal the pain. One must learn to swallow the tears and keep going, because stopping means the end. The biggest question of this journey is not, how far did they go, but why didn't they stop? The painful answer: they had gone too far to turn back. To stay would be to starve. To turn back would be to die. Ahead, however bleak, was hope. And so they kept going. Small names in history with big hearts. Lusina Wilson, a mother of 2, recounts how her family was swept away while crossing the river. Everything was lost. She saved only her son. Peter H. Burnett, who later became the first governor of California, was an immigrant. None of us really knew what was ahead. He wrote, but we all believed that something better was ahead. They were not heroes, but they were living testaments to perseverance and faith, even the most fragile. The Oregon Trail is now a blip on the tourist map, but each step the immigrants took carved a timeless lesson into the American landscape. No dream comes for free, and the price sometimes wasn't money, but youth, loved ones, or even a lifetime. Surviving the Oregon Trail requires more than just courage, it requires proper preparation. In Chapter 2, Survival Packs, What to Take and What to Leave Behind, we delve deeper into the psyche of those preparing to leave. What did they take with them to survive? What did they have to leave behind? And more importantly, what was lost forever in their hearts when the wheels started rolling? In modern times, we pack for a trip with rolling suitcases, checked luggage, and worry about whether we're missing toothpaste or a phone charger. But on the Oregon Trail, preparation wasn't about convenience, it was about survival. The oxcart they used, usually just 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, was the only space that held everything you, your family, and your future owned. There were no trucks. There were no supply stations along the way. Everything you needed to survive for 4 to 6 months had to fit in there. No one prepared perfectly, but the ones who survived weren't the strongest. They were the ones who packed the right things and left them out at the right times. A typical survival list for a caravan of migrants included dried food, flour, crushed corn, salted meat, dried beans, rice, hardtack, coffee, brown sugar, drinking water and water containers, because clean rivers and streams are not everywhere. Medical supplies, alcohol, bandages, needles and thread, laxatives, allergy powder, survival tools, axe, shovel, rope, gun and bullets, knife, needle and thread, flint, household items, cast iron pot, kettle, spoon, knife, wool blanket, coat, oil lamp. Many people bring cows and hens for eggs and fresh milk, the ultimate luxury on the journey. Humans are creatures who carry their past. A handkerchief from a dead mother. A sketch album. A nearly empty bottle of perfume. An unworn wedding dress. But on the Oregon Trail, emotions are a burden. Few people keep their souvenirs to the end of the trail. After a few hundred miles, a decision must be made. If you had to choose between a memory chest and a bag of flour, which would you choose? Harriet Scott Palmer, 11, recalled in her diary that her mother was forced to abandon a wooden chest containing her father's love letters because it tipped over while crossing a river. She cried all night, but the next morning she smiled at me as if nothing had happened. The Oregon Trail was not just a journey. It was a graveyard of objects. One count: hundreds of wooden tables, stools, dressers, mirrors, violins, sewing machines, rocking chairs, even bird cages, pots, pans, iron kettles, left behind because they were too heavy. We even saw mahogany chests left in the fields. Lucina Wilson said, "They must have been loved by their owners." The scene was repeated everywhere. Objects lying in the sun. Silent witnesses to sacrifice. At first, people thought they could take everything with them, from food to memories. But after a few weeks, the wheels bent, the cows wobbled, and the wind blew dust into their eyes. Everyone realized survival required less than they thought. If the chair broke, they sat on the ground. If there was no mirror, they looked at each other across the stream. If there was no table, they shared bread in their palms. Anything that did not serve the purpose of eating, drinking, healing, protecting themselves was considered a luxury. Many items that were once symbols of prestige now became obstacles to life. There was a packing philosophy that spread among the migrant groups. And whoever heard it had a higher chance of survival. The thing you need most is the thing you are willing to leave behind last. The thing that slows you down, kills you. The less you carry, the sooner you arrive. The value is not in the item, but in its ability to survive. Many families refused to bring their wedding dresses to get more bags of beans. Some gave up their place for a milk cow, rather than keeping a precious wooden table. Not everything could be left behind. There were things that were not in the trunk, but were still heavy as rocks, and no one could throw them away. Homesickness. A mother's last hug. The face of a father who died of illness on the road. You can't carry the past, but you can't shake it off either. One woman wrote home in a letter, "I've learned to live with a lighter car, and a heavier heart." By the time they reached Oregon, if they survived, many had nothing left but calloused hands and a family that had lost several members. But it was this shedding, both material and emotional, that made them more ready to start a new life. You can't start over if you keep holding on to everything that's old. If a grizzly bear crashes into camp in the middle of the night, you know what to do. If a blizzard hits, you can hide in the car. But if a child starts coughing, then has a fever, then dies after 3 days, what can you do? On the Oregon Trail, disease is the most ruthless and common enemy. People often picture the dangers of the wilderness in images of snakes, high mountains, and raging rivers. But the real killers on the 2.000-mile trail are things smaller than dust. Bacteria, viruses, parasites. An estimated 20.000 to 30.000 people died on the Oregon Trail. And most of them were not from accidents, but from disease. The mortality rate ranged from 6 to 10%. Of these, cholera was the most notorious culprit. Other common diseases included measles, typhoid, typhus, pneumonia, diarrhea, and dysentery. No doctors, no hospitals, no medicine, just fever, confusion, and small graves by the roadside. It seems simple, but water was a life and death factor. Along the way, caravans had to fetch water from rivers and streams. But no one knew whether the water was contaminated with human feces, dead animals, or pathogens from the previous caravan. A person who drank contaminated water could fall ill within hours. At first it was just diarrhea, then dehydration, convulsions, and death. J. Henry Brown wrote in his diary, "My father began vomiting in the morning. By noon he could not walk. In the evening we dug a grave for him on the hillside." This was not uncommon. Many families buried their loved ones right by the roadside, erecting a gravestone of scrap wood or a stone, and then leaving before dark. Imagine, you are a mother with a feverish child. No doctor, no medicine, no shelter, and no one dares to come near. On the Oregon Trail, the sick were isolated, not out of malice, but out of fear of contagion. Sick wagons were often tied to the back of the convoy. Many were even left in the middle of the desert, because the survival of the entire convoy depended on the speed at which they moved. There were families with only one survivor, pulling an empty ox cart through dusty miles. Small bodies, weak immune systems, and inadequate nutrition. Children were the most vulnerable to disease. Many parents watched helplessly as their child convulsed in their arms, not understanding why. There was no diagnosis, no medicine, just boiling water, prayers, and pain. My child had a fever for 4 days. One woman recalled, "I held him to my chest all night, listening to his breathing grow weaker. The next morning, he was gone." Many small graves were marked with little more than a bow, a kid's glove, or nothing at all. In the 19th century, medical knowledge was still obscure. People didn't understand viruses or bacteria. The cause of illness was often attributed to miasma or God's will. Some thought illness was caused by stroke. Some blamed it on punishment by the gods. Some sought fortune tellers and spells. This led to bad decisions, keeping the sick in a closed car, without opening the windows, making the air even more contaminated. Did you know that there could be 1 or 2 graves per mile of the Oregon Trail? Most were unmarked. No coffins, no prayers, a shroud, a stone marker, a whispered, "Forgive me," and then onward. Some people even pretended that there were no graves to avoid being dug up by wild animals. They parked their vehicles over the burial site as if nothing had happened. Death cannot be mourned for long, because survival does not allow for stopping. The strangest thing is, people still keep going. Even though they have lost their wives, children, and all their possessions, many people still do not stop. Because they know, to turn back is to die. To stay is to die. Only by continuing is there hope. That mentality, both strong and desperate, makes migrants like boats drifting along the river of fate. Without a rudder, without a rower, some caravans began to apply rudimentary medical rules, using vinegar and strong alcohol for disinfection, filtering water with cloth and wood ash, isolate sick people from the main vehicle, creating field clinics with quickly erected tents. They learn from their mistakes. They learn from the deaths of those who went before. And most importantly, they learn to respect the silence of death. For it lurks around every bend. Today, Americans often remember the Oregon Trail as a miracle. But behind the beautiful maps and tourist museums are thousands of cries that have been washed away by the wind. There are no monuments to the children who died of dysentery. There are no memorials to the mothers left behind by typhoid fever. But if you follow the old route, you will see the weedy graves, the unmarked stones, and understand that America was built not just on dirt, but on bones and blood. If disease was a silent killer, nature was an open killer. For the caravans heading west, the world was not a map, it was a deadly maze of high mountains, raging rivers, scorched grasslands, and angry skies. No one from the east could have imagined that the land could kill. One of the most terrifying challenges was river crossings. The Platte, the Snake, the Green, these were waters where, if you timed it wrong, your entire family could be swept away in minutes. My husband swam across to test the depth. Lucina Wilson recalled, "When we tried to cross, the current was stronger than we thought. We lost 2 cows, half our provisions, and the wagon nearly capsized. There were no bridges, no mooring lines. We had to rely on luck and rowing skills." The tragedy of the river is not just drowning, it is losing everything that keeps you alive. When people think of natural hazards, they often think of bears, snakes, or wolves. But in reality, bison herds are the caravan's real nightmare. Herds of thousands of bison can cause violent stampedes, crushing everything underfoot. The ground shook. The sky was full of dust. People screamed. One car was thrown like a box. Luckily, no one died, but the tents were torn apart like paper, said Sarah Bird, a migrant. With their speed and weight, it was impossible for the bison to change direction. You could only run. Nature doesn't always warn you. The sky was clear. Then an hour later, hailstones were falling like bullets. The morning was sunny and warm, but by nightfall, a snowstorm had blanketed everything. And lightning strikes the tents, killing entire families while they're staying. The weather does not follow human schedules. And on the Oregon Trail, the weather is a capricious god, both beautiful and cruel. Even seemingly small things can be deadly. Rattlesnakes hiding in woodpiles can kill in just a few hours if left untreated. Mosquitoes carrying malaria or dengue fever. The scorching sun burns the skin, causing dehydration. Sedges tear the legs of cows, forcing the entire wagon train to stop for lack of traction. This is where a torn shoe can kill you. Because if your feet are sore, you can't walk. If you can't walk, you're left behind. It's cruel but true. Nature doesn't care about you, who you are, what you have lost, how much you pray. All are meaningless when the river overflows or rocks and soil fall from the cliff. On that trail, nature is not the foundation, it is the challenge. But it is also from those challenges that humans are forced to evolve in survival thinking. Learn to observe the sky to predict the weather. Learn to wait 3 days after a rain before crossing the river. Learn to create a cart circle at night to protect against wild animals. That evolution does not come from school, but from blood, tears and intuition. Sometimes just one right intuition. You saved the whole caravan. Reaching Oregon does not mean you are the strongest, it may mean you are the last one alive. Not everyone can overcome nature. But there are people who, day by day, step by step, have chosen to stand up even though their feet are bleeding, have chosen to keep going even though there are high hills ahead, have chosen to live, even though the whole world seems to want them dead. And it is they, the ones who do not give up, who have reached the other shore, not because nature gives way, but because they do not retreat. The Oregon Trail was not a migration. It was a rite of passage, where people were stripped of their comforts, stripped of their illusions, and confronted with the most primal question: who are we when we have nothing? They came west with no gold, no furniture, no intact dreams. They came with calloused hands, broken hearts, and eyes that had seen death all too close. But it was they who packed up the past, who crossed disease, raging rivers, whirlwinds, and treacherous lands, and laid the foundation for a new America. Not the America of the conquerors, but the America of the unconquerable. Today, one can drive the Oregon Trail in just a few days. But to truly understand the journey, you have to imagine yourself walking barefoot, pulling a bleeding wagon of hope, not knowing who will be alive tomorrow. There are no monuments for every child who died of fever, no grand ceremony for a discarded wedding dress. But if you look silently into the western sunset, you can hear it, the footsteps of those whose names are not spoken. They do not ask for credit. They just go, and never stop.